Welcome to the chapel of Robinson College here at the University of Cambridge. It's 2020, it's lockdown and it's empty. So this time we're conducting a series of interviews with key thinkers from around the world. And our theme is the fall of Jerusalem's great temple in the 70th year of the first century. The temple had been the meeting place of heaven and earth. It was where humanity encountered otherness. In a largely post-religious world, for many today it is through art, literature and poetry that we might encounter the other. Today we're very pleased to welcome from Washington DC, C. Lillian Green, who is widely known not only as a poet, but as a lawyer, a teacher, a mediator, a playwright and a public speaker. The cultural observations in her work address life, love and spirituality, as well as relationships, history and politics. Widely recognised as a social justice leader, her approach is celebrated as a form of highly accessible but no-nonsense truth-telling. And our reading today focuses on the theme of that kind of truth-telling.
The gifts God gave were that some would be lieutenants, some prophets, some heralds, some leaders and teachers, all to equip the people of otherness for the work of a campaign, for building up the body of Christ until all of us come to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to maturity, to the measure of the full stature of Christ. We must no longer be children, thrown back and forth and blown about by every trend of truth, by people's trickery, by their craftiness and deceptive scheming. But, truthing in love, we must grow up in every way into Him who is the head, into Christ, from whom the whole body, joined and knitted together by every supporting ligament, as each part is working properly, promotes the body's growth, building itself up in love.
Sir Lillian Green, a very warm welcome to Robinson College Chapel in its digital manifestation. You're well known, I think increasingly so, as a poet in the US, and I think have been very widely applauded within various wings of the civil rights movements as they are today. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about US history. At the moment, the US seems to be at the center of a crisis that's sent ripples throughout the world. And the US does have a very particular history when it comes to racism. And I wonder, your poetry offers a glimpse into that history. And it's not as historical, it's not as far in the past as we might think it is. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how you've integrated poetry with history.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm pleased to be speaking with you. I think you're correct in noting that history is a part of what is currently happening in this country. I've written a poem in 2016 to commemorate the opening of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which was built in Washington, D.C. in 2016. And the poem I wrote is called The Present. And the poem itself speaks to the fact that that museum is in effect a present, as in a gift. But it also addresses the fact that the past is always in the present, and that everything that we are doing right now encompasses what has already been done. And so when that poem starts, it says the history is a teaching master. Nothing in the present gets past her. Those who are wise seek her. They seek her for lessons from the past, for guidance about future tasks. Culture confides in history. Their relationship is not a mystery. They sing in harmony, dance intertwined, thousands of years of synchronized time. Yet to the past, history and culture are not confined. Indeed, the past is always in the present, and the past does not feel pleasant. And I think where we find ourselves in this country right now is that the past does not feel pleasant. And so they don't want to address it. But the reality is, just like in life, when your children have experienced certain things in their childhood, it will be there when they become an adult. And you cannot pretend, you cannot wish it away. You must face it and deal with it. Because we have with the murder, the killing of Mr. George Floyd, the manner in which he was killed, which has sparked this outrage, around the world. It affects you in a way that I don't think people were really ready for. But in many ways, it was simply a manifestation of what has gone on in the United States for centuries. So the manner in which the police officer keeps his knee on the neck of another human being in a very casual way. His hand is in his pocket. His sunglasses are on his head. He's looking directly into a camera, seemingly unconcerned about the consequences for what he is doing to another human being. So there must be some space in him that does not acknowledge the humanity of this person upon whose knee he has his knee on his neck. But in the United States, in 1669, this country had what were called slave codes. And Virginia, as the first colony, passed the slave codes. And one of those slave codes was entitled An Act About the Casual Killing of Slaves. An Act About the Casual Killing of Slaves. And in that particular code, it allowed for you to kill your enslaved person under circumstances involving punishment or inadvertence, so that if you did kill them, it would be deemed a casual killing. And so somehow that would mitigate the death. You might be absolved of having killed the person. And some years back, I wrote a poem called Casual Killing that speaks to that slave code, but also what we witnessed with Mr. Floyd. I wrote the poem in 2015. And the poem is in the voice of the police officer. And the police officer starts out by saying, "We are not here to be your minister. Instead, we convert you into that which is sinister, a monster, a demon, a menace. For causing your death, we will not do penance." So that's how it opens. And so when you think about the fact that this country, the first colony, passes slave codes, and one of them is an act about the casual killing of slaves, and in 2020, we can have a police officer who casually kills a Black man on television, in effect, with no seeming sense that there will be any consequence. And so the past, again, is always in the present. And that really shows you the linkage. And I think what we see in the worldwide response to it is that we have reached that point of a tipping, if you will, that we have to now recognize something is going on here. And it's been going on for some time. So the past is always in the present. It does not always feel pleasant.
Why do you think the George Floyd incident triggered the world in the way that because this sort of thing is happening all the time in the US?
Right.
Why do you think that particular instance?
I think that there is a linkage, if you will, in the psyche, in the memory, if you will, the DNA of Black people who have been protesting killings since they've been happening. There have been some form of protest associated with the police brutality in the Black community. But I think that there is something about the very casual nature in which this person killed him while the cameras were rolling, unconcerned about it. And that it really touched a space that people cannot escape from. You cannot pretend you didn't see it. You cannot unsee it. And if you live in America, wherever you may live, that this type of conduct towards another human being is not happening to people who are not Black by and large. So that the ripple effect, I think, has something to do with the larger implications of history around the world and the enslavement of African people and peoples who are not white around the world who have experienced something similar, maybe not as egregious as what they saw happen to Mr. Floyd, but they have seen some version of it. And that was just the final straw. And there's no turning back now. And this is the place where once you've hit the bottom, you have to go up. You have to go up. And I think what it also speaks to is it's not just a matter of a race crisis. This is a crisis of humanity, because you have to really not see a human being to do something as callous as the killing of Mr. Floyd in that manner.
So, and you were attributing this to a historically conditioned, I think you called it a space inside somebody's mind that allows you to view another human being as a non-human. I wonder if you could talk about a more positive impact of history. I think you wrote a poem, was it called Three Wise Women? Sojourner Truth, Ida B. Wells, Harriet Tubman.
Those are my ladies. Let me just say, you make me smile when you bring them up. Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, and Ida B. Wells, three wise women with much to tell. You know, they walk with the power and dignity of a proud race, carrying the womanhood this country tried to erase. Pedestals they did not need, they were elevated by their deeds. Oh my goodness, those women, what they did, they inspire me. They're my three wise women, because when I think about what I have been able to do, or what I think about what I cannot do, I remember what they did do and what they did not have. And so they are an inspiration in so many ways. You know, Sojourner talked, Harriet Tubman, she walked, and Ida B. Wells, she balked. She wrote about lynchings of Black people by the score. Facts and figures could not be ignored. You know, Sojourner, she replaced her enslaver's name with the name of truth. And the truth is what she spoke to countless groups. Harriet was the Moses in many ways of Black people, in terms of liberating them from the bondage that they faced in this country. And so those are the wise women that I call upon. And so thank you for bringing that energy into this conversation.
I mean, they're 19th century women, aren't they? But when you hear their voice, they feel disturbingly contemporary.
Yes. Because I think this is another example of how the past is always present. Well, I think they're contemporary in the sense that what they talked about, what they did, is still very relevant. I mean, the idea that we continue to need some form of discussions of lynchings. Ida B. Wells wrote about lynchings and the reasons for the lynchings. And a lot of times it was predicated upon some false notion of some sort of slight to a white woman, when in fact there was always an economic component to not wanting Black people to amass any sort of economic independence in certain environments. And so the death of the person who was economically a leader in a community. And Sojourner Truth, she's out talking about what happened with her. She had the power and the wherewithal to change her name to the name of Truth, because she wanted to pick the name that would identify her as she saw herself, as her mark of her freedom. And then, of course, Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman, she physically put her life and her body on the line to free her people, to go back down to the South, to get her family, because love for her and family were so important. And part of what the institution of slavery did was to speak to this, the falsity that somehow these people did not have emotions, that they did not love, they didn't have the capacity to feel. And everything that Harriet Tubman did in terms of freeing her people was rooted in love, and that if she was free and her family was not free, what would the freedom mean? And so that's why she would continue to go back to get her family members, because love is really the driving energy that propelled her.
Was it Harriet Tubman that she was the Underground Railroad, wasn't she? But did she have a role in the Civil War as well?
Yes, she was a spy for the Union Army. She was she is the only person, female in history, who at that point was utilized as a strategist to free over 700 enslaved people who were in South Carolina. I think it's the Combahee River plantation, where Harriet Tubman in effect led that expedition to get those people freed. So yes, and she actually appealed to get her money from a pension for her services during the Civil War from the Union Army.
You mentioned economics. And I think I must have heard Angela Davis speaking in the early 1970s about the relationship between economics and racism as it's manifest in the US. It seems to have been a battle that's been going on for my entire lifetime, and it remains live today when I read Angela Davis today, but people like Cornel West as well. I mean, is that true in your experience? What might the relationship be between economic realities as they are today and systemic racism?
Well, there continues to be a connection. I think part of it, if you look in the United States, we had a constitution that was written that literally put in writing that Africans who were enslaved in this country would be counted as 3/5 of a human being for purposes of the representation of the white people in the House of Representatives and in Congress. So they would be counted because they were valued in their physicality for representation of other people, but they were not able to vote. And then at the same time, you have people who were looking at them as though they're not human. And so again, we get back to this crisis of humanity, because if you think that these are not really human beings, they never will deserve what human beings deserve. And so we have a whole body of laws that were implemented in this country. So after we end the Civil War, after we technically end slavery in the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which only ends slavery in the hands of private citizens, it can continue for the conviction of felons. So we now have a prison industrial complex where the prison in many ways has replaced the plantation. And there's a wonderful book that was written called The New Jim Crow, which really speaks to the whole notion of how prisons have replaced plantations and the utilization of the Black body. And we have publicly traded prisons on the stock exchange. And so that requires them to have Black bodies. And so you have to devalue Black bodies in order to value them for the purposes that you need them for. And we clearly know that there were a number of communities in the states where Black people were thriving. They were separate, but they were thriving communities, and they were burned to the ground. So we have the Tulsa, Oklahoma, we have Rosewood in Florida, and all of these communities were vibrant, thriving, separate, but they put to the lie the notion that these people were somehow incompetent, illiterate, could not take care of themselves, would not be able to function absent a white person instructing them on how they should live and be. And in many ways, that's what Reconstruction showed, because the 12 years after the Civil War was known as the period of Reconstruction in this country. And that's when you had a number of formerly enslaved people who became parts of the legislature. Many times they were caricatured in the media, but the reality is that 12-year period, Reconstruction was working in many ways, but the white population was upset about the progress. And this is only 12 years after having been enslaved for over 200 and nearly 250 at that point. And so the physical removal of some people from Congress, the ending of Reconstruction in 1877, and then we move forward to the Jim Crow laws, the development of the Ku Klux Klan, which is a terrorist organization that still exists in this country. We have what they call the Black Codes, all these laws that to control the movement of Black people, whether you could be more than a certain number of people at a certain time having a conversation. So all of these things are done to undermine progress and financial stability in a community that could take care of itself on its own, but was not, there was no desire for that to happen. And so, yes, the idea of the economics continues. Last Saturday, we had the funeral of one of the stalwarts of the civil rights movement, John Lewis. And one of his speakers at his service really spoke to the plantation economy that exists in the country. That stems from the plantation system of having enslaved people, where you make your money having not paid anybody for their wages and for their labor. And so that financially you're able to build tremendous amounts of wealth over generations, and yet the people who did the work could not.
The response to this from academic institutions, from secular liberals, from privileged white people. Everyone's rushing in with their great ideas at the moment. How ought privileged white people, far removed from or so we think, far removed from the realities of slavery and systemic racism, where do people in an institution like Cambridge start with an adequate response to what's happening?
Well, I think one of the first things people can do is really begin to demand a truthful educational system about the history. Because if you can start with the truth about what actually happened in England, what happened in America, then you begin to see, okay, how long did that go on? What allowed it to go on? What part of humanity would say that, well, these are not really people? Because this is not true. There was no point in the continuum of human life that people of African descent were not people. So when the white people, let's just say, wrote down these laws that characterized them as less than human, what was it in their inhumanity that prompted that to happen? So I think we need to begin with education, and we need to begin with truthful education and tell the students what happened, when it happened, why it happened, and where it happened, and what are the correlations between what happened then and what happened now. And last year in this country, the New York Times published a magazine called the 1619 Project. It's really worth reading. And it marked the 400-year anniversary of the first ship of enslaved Africans that landed in Virginia in 1619. And in this project, it really delves into the correlation between what happened from 1619 to the present, the 400 years, so that you can really see the correlation between healthcare, housing, all of these various areas of everyday living as human beings that are directly related to having enslaved a population systematically, intentionally, without any regard for the humanity of the people. Because you have to say to yourself, well, they don't really feel, they're not quite me, they're not people, and therefore I can justify what has been done to them. Well, no, there is no justification for what has been done. And now if you begin to look at the reality of what has been done, and you ask yourself, I think there's a woman named Jane Elliott who poses a question to her audience where she asks the white people, would any of you, words to this effect, would any of you want to change places with a Black person, given what's going on? And there's not a hand that goes up because they know what's happening. They know, and they don't want it to happen to them. Professor, he's deceased now, Derek Bell, had written a book some years ago called Faces at the Bottom of the Well. And he has these little short essays of examples of experiences that have happened in terms of race in America. And one of his stories is about these aliens that come to the United States, I believe, and they ask, they offer rather to cure all the ills. All they want in return are the Black people. They want you to give them the Black people so they can take them to wherever this place is that they're going to go back to. And he would ask his students about this, and the white students' responses were always different from the Black students. Like Black students, well, what do you think would happen? And the Black students typically would say that they would be lined up at gunpoint and be given to these aliens. And the white people would tell themselves, well, no, that wouldn't happen. But history has shown that that is exactly what would happen. And so you tell yourself one thing, but you know the reality is something else. And so I think there's like a cognitive dissonance that happens. Yeah. You really want to know how to begin, demand that there be history taught that is true, that is accurate, because there's a principle in the Akan tradition of West Africa called the Sankofa principle. And the Sankofa is a bird, and the Sankofa, the bird looks back at the past to understand the past in order to know how to go forward into the future. But I do believe that if you begin to know what happened, why it happened, then you can begin to heal what happened. And until you do that, you won't start the healing process.
One of the defensive reactions that you hear to this is people call it a cancel culture. For instance, the tearing down of statues, which perhaps we'll come on to in a minute. You can't deny our past. You can't pretend this stuff didn't happen. And people are very offended at the removal of statues, as though the only history that we know is the right one. I wonder what do you say to people that are happy with the narrative of the past that we already have, and who see some of the movements around the world at the moment as threatening the familiar histories that make us comfortable with who we are?
Well, the history that makes the us, whoever the us you refer to, the us that you're referring to are primarily the white people, because that makes white people happy. But that's not the history that makes non-white people happy, because that's not the truth. And whatever your spiritual discipline may be, I'm certain that the truth will set you free. And if you continue to operate in the space of falsity, you will never move forward. And if you just look in your own family dynamic, your personal family dynamics, whatever that may be for people, there were things that happened in childhoods. There are things that happened that were pushed under the rug. And maybe at some point you go into counseling, you get some sort of therapy, and you begin to grapple with what happened, why it happened, when it happened. And then you can move forward with the healing. The same thing is required for countries, for nations, for this world, because we live in a world that is, as we see now with this pandemic, very connected. And you cannot act as if you're in your own little silo, unaffected by anything else. And while you tell yourself that you're comfortable with this false history that you're relying upon that was told to you, the reality is that you're living in a deluded space of the unreal. And the more we get to deal with what is real, what is true, the better off I think we're going to be in terms of how humanity functions. And while we're in the space of the pandemic, racism is a worldwide pandemic as well. And I think part of what happened with Mr. Floyd has shown you the worldwide pandemic that racism is, and why there is a need globally to raise the vibration of the world, because the world has responded to him. And it's not simply because of him, it's because of things that have happened where those protests are taking place. And I think the beauty of it is that it's not just Black people, it's not just us complaining or trying to bring to the fore the truth that has always existed, because the truth is always there, even if it's covered up. It is always there. It's just like the past is always in the present.
Yeah, can I ask you a final question then? And this is on the subject of statues. This is because the theme for this term, for our chapel services, is the fall of the temple. And one of the functions of the temple in most cultures is that it's supposed to house the statue of a god. And the statue, above all, is the thing that's to be worshipped. It enforces compliance with a dominant ideology. And it reminds the populace of the strengths that we value and the people that we absolutely have to admire. And now that statues are being torn down, I wonder, I'd love to hear your opinion on that process.
Well, I agree that statues that pay homage, honor the debasement of human beings, or people who did that, should be taken down. In this country, it's primarily the Confederate flag and Confederate statues that were put up at different times in this country as messages of basically continued terror for Black people, to remind them of what your space is and where you belong in this country. And the idea that we would put them in public squares, on university campuses where we're being educated, but we're not being told the truth. So we revere who? It has not been Black people revering these Confederate flags or the Confederate statue, and they have complained about it all this time. But now again, I think one of the vaccines for the racism is the removal of the statues, the removal of these flags that pay homage and honor that which is not honorable. And for those who want to continue to keep those statues up, who want to continue to live in the fiction, then the healing is not going to come to them as quickly as it might. But you cannot continue to say we want to have the statue of someone whose purpose was to continue in perpetuity the enslavement of Black people in this country. That's what the Confederate flag stands for. That's what those Confederate generals and monuments, they stood for that. And there's no denying that the whole Civil War, if you look at the secession documents, each of the states that seceded from the Union put in there that the reason that they were primarily doing this was because their way of life was going to be disrupted, which meant that they would not be able to continue to enslave the Black people. And even the Black soldiers, the Union Army had a contingent of nearly 250,000 U.S. colored troops. And there is a monument to them in Washington, D.C. at the African American Civil War Memorial with all of the names of these men. And these names come from the National Archives of the Registry, and people can go and see who these people were, what they were fighting for, because they were fighting for freedom, because freedom is who you are in your soul. I mean, we are born to live and to be free. And when that is compromised in any way, people are going to respond to it, even if you don't realize that's what you're responding to. But we all strive to live and to breathe in a truth that allows us to be who the Creator meant us to be. We're born free. We are meant to live and be free. And those who seek to undermine, hamper, or in case of statues and flags, reward those who were not in favor of others being free, then therein lies the problem.
So we've spoken a little about poetry as a literary temple, a place where humanity might encounter some form of otherness. And the question is, does poetry, as you understand it, give access to some form of hope and some form of otherness?
Yes. And I say that definitively because I think that poetry and all forms of creativity are the most immediate way to demonstrate connection to the Creator. Because when you are being creative, you are closest to that which the Creator has called you to be. And if we look at the poetry in itself as an opportunity to engage the body temple, we each have the body temple. What are we doing with the body temple? And poetry allows you to engage the body temple in many ways. It's spoken from the mouth, it's heard from the ear, it is thought of through the brain, it is felt in the heart, and it is written with the hand. So that particular genre of literature speaks to who we are as people. And I think sometimes poetry resonates in ways that prose does not. I mean, we hear poetry and we can feel the poetry. We can either smile because it made us feel something, remember something about an experience that we've had. And the pandemic, which is happening now, is affecting the body temple in terms of health. And there is so much creativity that has taken place during this pandemic for people speaking to how they're feeling being in this. A lot of poetry has been written. I have what I call my COVID creativity, in which I've been writing children's books. And I feel like these are the people who I should be speaking to now, because the little children are closer, they're closer to the Creator than adults are, more open and receptive to feeling what they actually feel, to living as we are intended to be it, and they're so free. And I think why people like to see how children respond until they are overlaid with adult perceptions and perspectives is that they're very free and they're very honest in ways that sometimes may seem brutal, but it's a truth that comes from, most of the time, a space of real innocence, because they don't expect people to not be truthful with them. And I know that when parents sometimes will not be honest with their child because they don't think they should tell them certain things, but I take the position that if a child can formulate a question, the child can understand your answer. And when you don't tell them the truth, they know because they feel it. So I feel like that's like the poetic space in their body temple that feels that they have not been told an accurate account of what is going on. And if you tell them the truth, because they have already formulated the question, there is a way to tell things to children in ways that they can understand it. But clearly, if they have asked you the question, they can understand your answer, and they can tell by your cadence, by your hesitation, by how you pause in your words, whether or not you are telling them the truth. Because what does the truth do? The truth will free us. And so I feel like poetry, unlike other genres, is an opportunity for us to not only exercise various aspects of the body temple, but to speak truths that people can maybe hear in a poem that they could not necessarily hear any other way. So I thank you for that and for asking me that.
Your particular style of poetry is very distinctive as well. I mean, you mentioned the different dimensions. It's not just the naked words on a sheet. There's a performance that you bring with it that feels like it's part of the poetry. The delivery feels like it's part of the entire dynamic. And I wonder, where did you learn that? I mean, is this a style that do you have particular poets or authors that you have recognized in them something that works for you?
Well, thank you for asking me that question. Poems started to come to me in 2005. I had not written poetry before that. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of them. They just started to come. And initially I was surprised, and I didn't know what I was supposed to do with them. I did not really study poetry growing up. I loved to read, but it was not necessarily poetry. But when the poems started to come, they came to me in what I call the rhythm of the poetry. And as I progressed with it, I realized that I wrote in a certain way. I learned that they're called couplets, but they would come to me in these rhyming schemes. Sometimes I have a tress up 3, but for the most part, it's rhythmic. And I remember calling a friend of mine and telling him, I don't know the rules of poetry. I mean, I went to law school. I know civil procedure. I know some criminal procedure. I don't know the rules of poetry, but they were coming. And so I said, okay, I just will create my own way of doing this. And so what I recognized that was most important for me in conveying what was coming through me is that I maintained the rhythm, because the rhythm is important to the hearer, but was also important to me as the receiver, so that when I share the poetry, you can hear the rhythm in my voice, but when you read the poetry, you will be able to read the rhythm as well, and you will feel the rhythm, because we are vibrational as human beings, and we do feel things. I mean, we feel things with music, we feel things with words. And for me, my poems rhyme. They all have rhyming schemes because that's how they come to me. But I also am very, very aware that there is a feeling space that I hope that these poems touch.
C. Lillian Green, thank you very much.
Thank you.